I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast. Most conversations about crime focus on what's going wrong. But in Philadelphia, District Attorney Larry Krasner has built a different kind of story, one grounded in data, transparency, and research. His office isn't just tracking crime, it's using data to change how safety is measured. In this episode, I talk with Mr. Krasner about what it means to run a prosecutor's office with a constant eye towards data, hiring criminologists, publishing open data sets, and making policy decisions based on evidence rather than anecdote. We talk about the results that approach has produced and how his office uses data to build trust between the justice system and the people it serves. Krasner also reflects on the challenges of telling that story publicly. How do you communicate progress when a narrative of fear still dominates? And why telling the truth all the time has become both his mantra and his media strategy, and I must say can be seen as a guiding light for this podcast. Here's my conversation with Larry Krasner on data, prevention, and what it takes to build a justice system that earns belief through evidence. My guest today is the District Attorney of the City of Philadelphia, Larry Krasner. Larry, thanks for joining the show. So starting off, same question I've asked all my guests. Who are you? What is your background? How did you get here today?
I am Larry Krasner, the elected DA in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, about 7.5 years almost 8 years, completing a second term, likely to have a third term. How did I get here today? I got here by coming out of law school in 1987, wanting to do criminal justice, working as a defense attorney and a civil rights attorney for 30 years, and then, frankly, out of disgust, running for DA and surprising everybody by winning.
All right. And I know that one of the major themes of your office, certainly from somebody that uses a lot of open data, has been to embrace data as a way of communicating your approach to criminal justice. Can you walk me through how your office has done that and how you've sort of innovated in a lot of the prosecutorial use of publicly available data?
Well, silly me, I like to science. So when I came into office, it came to my attention that there was no criminologist on staff or even readily available to consult with the office. There never had been. And I hired one. That would be Dr. Oren Gur, G-U-R, who not only is a criminologist, but is also now the head of our data lab. Dr. Gur was successful in obtaining a bunch of grant money so that we could science. And we did. Fairly soon thereafter, we decided to make it transparent, public-facing. We put up a dashboard with a lot of data. At any given time, some of that data is going to make us look good. Some of it's going to make us look bad. But it's the truth. And, the truth has inherent value. So we went that route. That was a big part of it. But then we took it a step further, which is that in good times and bad, and of course, the whole country had some pretty terrible times during the pandemic, we decided that we were dissatisfied with the way American media, American entertainment, American politics presents criminal justice issues, and that in order to be reformers, which we are, that we had to be effective in communicating through storytelling, through data, through whatever means we could, the truth. And we've done that with a systematic, very, I would say, aggressive form of engaging the media in good times and bad times, engaging them with data, challenging them to contextualize what they are reporting in ways that are generally supportive of what they're doing, seeking out journalists who want to get it right and trying to help them get it right. I can tell you that I believe that Philly has been more successful than many other places in doing this because several months ago, when I was starting my campaign for a third term, we had national pollsters of a very high and competent level who gave me the surprising news that in all of their polling across the country for many different mayoral races in many different cities, there was only one city where when you polled the residents, they said crime is going down. And that city is Philadelphia. So I take that as an indication not only that Philadelphia voters and residents are sophisticated, and I can talk about why, but also as an indication that this very persistent, dogged years of messaging through storytelling and through data have had their impact, that some of the journalism that's done now is much more contextualized geographically and in many other ways.
You're scooping my questions for the second half of the interview as far as whether or not Philadelphians believe crime is going down. I guess let's get into that. Why would you think that, one, Philadelphians think it's going down? And two, what's in the water in Philadelphia that sort of isn't in the water in New York City or Chicago or New Orleans or anywhere else?
Well, let me just reference two things for which I take no credit. Please note that Philadelphia County is the same as Philadelphia City. In other words, the county line is in the same place. If you go to Pittsburgh, the second biggest city in Pennsylvania, we'll find that it is Allegheny County, and therefore a very large portion of the residents of Allegheny County are not urban. They do not exist in an urban environment. I do think that the fact that Philly is all urban, I think it leads to a level of sophistication. We're not talking about theoretical crime across some sort of suburban urban line. We're talking about what we see on our streets every day. And I think that that is significantly helpful. Another thing, and I say this from my 30 years as a very busy trial lawyer in Philadelphia and having picked a lot of juries, another thing that's really kind of different about Philadelphia as compared to other places where I picked juries and tried cases is that it's extremely common to have a potential juror who has a police officer in the family, victim of a very serious crime in the family, and also somebody doing time or someone who has done hard time. There is this ability in Philly for people to really see the system in three dimensions and to understand all the different aspects. It probably relates to why civil lawyers try to do cases in Philadelphia over other jurisdictions. You have the second poorest currently, or the poorest more recently, big city in America. You have people who have a very close connection to good and bad policing, safer and less safe periods of time, victimization in all of its different aspects. And so they do see the system in three dimensions. So I can't really take credit for any of that, but because that's just sort of structural here. But I will say that I think what we can take credit for is being donkeys. And I don't mean Democrats, I mean donkeys. Simply continuing to tell the truth over and over, week after week, in press conferences that we call and in interviews, and doing that for year after year. If you just keep telling the truth, eventually people will start to listen. Not necessarily all people, but the journalists who wanted to get it right from the beginning, they're going to get it right. And they're going to start to report in ways that are contextualized, that do not simply suggest that a single incident establishes a pattern, and so on.
So what, I guess, sticking with this falling crime in Philadelphia, I mean, obviously Philadelphia has seen an enormous drop in crime and shootings and in violence over the last 3 or 4 years. What would you, sitting in your seat, attribute that decline to?
I would attribute it to a few things. I mean, obviously any crime trends are probably the result of 15 or 20 really major local and national factors. Anybody who tells you otherwise is probably just a sleazy politician trying to take credit. So there's no question that a lot of this relates to national factors. For example, the pandemic was an absolute catastrophe all over the country, and Philadelphia came out of the pandemic with year after year improvement. That improvement in recent years has always exceeded the national average for cities of over 1 million. I think some of the local factors that we see are that there's a much bigger emphasis on prevention, investing in prevention. And I do think that's the great lesson of the pandemic, that when you strip away open classrooms, high school football teams, arts programs, available employment, job programs, when you strip it away, determine how disastrous, catastrophic that is, but you also determine that we shouldn't simply put the same money back in, we should be doubling and tripling it. So there has been a real sea change in Philly in terms of interest in investing heavily in prevention. The second thing is that we have been doing a much better job, not good enough, but a much better job at using forensics to make sure that we solve crimes, to make sure that innocent people don't go to jail for the people who actually committed the crime and are still out there. That has included a whole litany of forensic tools that were really not available before, and also some methodology to try to create catalogs and databases of things that will help us to link ballistic evidence to other ballistic evidence, things that will help us to determine interconnection of people in shooting groups, things that will allow us to capture video, which is now almost everywhere around the city. It just gives such a nice toolbox to detectives who are trying to solve crimes. I think it makes a big difference. Those two together, I would say modern enforcement through forensics, among other things, and heavy investment in prevention.
The conversation typically revolves around the crime side of things. There were 50 murders in a city. There were 30 robberies, 20 arrests. We had a 15% theft clearance rate. How does adding in the prosecutorial side, the court side of data that you've done, how does that move the public conversation forward? And how do you decide which pieces of your puzzle to add to the public conversation?
Great question. Well, to some extent, we don't. I mean, we do a dashboard that faces the public that includes all kinds of data, 100, 150, 200 different data points, some of which at any given time make us look bad and some of which make us look good. And we don't just put in the data that would be generated by this office or its actions. We contextualize it. So, for example, we look at how many incidents of a crime there are. And then we look at how many arrests from those incidents. And then we look at how many of those cases are charged. And then we look at what happens with those cases. That's not typically done. There's usually this disconnect between incidents and how many of those cases are solved. Clearance rate or the solve rate is incredibly important because all the criminology indicates that people are less likely to commit a crime if they think they're getting caught. Clearly more important than how quickly your case is going to get tried, although that matters, or how long the sentence is, although that matters even less, right? So we have synthesized all of that rather than letting the commentary be this misleading, suggestive commentary that if the DA's office doesn't win every case, that's all on the DA's office. We start in a different place. So, for example, if you have 1,000 retail thefts, and there have been periods when retail thefts were up in Philadelphia, among other places. If you have 1,000 retail thefts, but you have an 8% arrest rate, that means out of your 1,000 retail thefts, there's only 80 arrests coming out of that, okay? We can talk all day long about what happened with those 80 arrests. Should they have been convictions? Should they have been diverted with some other kind of accountability but no conviction? Should it have gone to drug treatment or housing? We can talk all day long about the 80, but we also have to talk about the 920 where there were no arrests and why that happened. What is going on with retailers who no longer have store security stop people? What is going on with police departments who may be doing a really good job at solving homicides, but because of staffing issues or other issues are unable to respond to these crimes? I don't say any of this to throw shade on retailers or the police or to say that our office is doing things right, but it's not a real conversation. If all you're going to do with 1,000 retail thefts is talk about the 80 where there were arrests. So what we try to do is make sure the context is bigger. And frankly, you should go bigger than that. We should be talking about what is happening with unhoused people, what is happening with opioids, what is happening with drug treatment, what is happening with access to health care, and what is happening with the destruction of the mental health system during the rise of mass incarceration. Because every one of these factors feeds levels of retail theft. All of that has to be discussed as opposed to the usual cartoon hammer nail narrative, which is who got arrested, what did you do to them, and doesn't even take into account whether the witnesses were willing to show up. Totally separate point. But you have to talk about the whole thing holistically if you're serious about public safety, and we are.
And so what has your office learned from having done, all of the internal innovative research and then also publishing all this data? Have you had any major findings, anything that's just completely changed how you operate that you thought you'd do one way and now you do it completely differently because of what you've learned?
I guess the good news is that when we came up with policies, we came up with ideas. We had already looked at criminological research to see what was going on. So we weren't just making it up or flipping a coin. We were coming at it with some scientific basis. And then later we would come back, and if the data supported that it was effective, we would stick with it. If the data indicated that we were wrong or that it wasn't working well, we've shifted. In general, the data has supported us. When we changed our bail policies, not to seek cash bail for certain low-level offenses, these independent studies and our own done later supported that was a solid policy, for example. Our safety numbers, we're going to have a 50-year low, 50-plus year low in homicides this year, almost certainly. Also support that you can have a huge reduction in incarceration, which we have had, and you can have public safety. So mostly the news has been good, but I'll give you an example of one where we did have to pivot and we had to change. We had a diversion program having to do with car thefts and juveniles. And based on the research indicated it should be a relatively short-term program. So we did that. Guess what? It wasn't working very well. We were seeing a lot of the kids who were diverted get arrested again shortly thereafter. And so we switched. Despite the research, we made the programming lengthier. As opposed to a few months, it became a year or more. And when we did that, the data shifted completely, and we were seeing that this was a highly successful program. Okay, we should do that. I mean, there's no successful business in America that doesn't look at what's actually happening when you try something new to figure out what works and what doesn't. I consider that, frankly, though, to be just a part of the process, that we should always be looking at our policies. We should be seeing whether we're meeting our goals and whether those goals promote our purpose, which is justice. And I would define that essentially as safety, but also freedom.
So you mentioned the good news, and yeah, I think 1965 is the last time Philly's had this few murders through September. Certainly, just looking at the police department's data, almost all crime is down, violent crime is down, property crime is down. Where is the bad news? What keeps you up? What worries you right now?
Well, a lot of things keep me up. Some of the worst news is that the president of the United States, I hate to have to call him that, but I guess he is that, is basically doing everything he possibly could to undermine prevention. When you are shifting in the last 3 months wealth to the wealthy, and we have seen a bigger improvement in the wealth of the top 10% of people, meaning top 10% economically. When you're doing that, you're taking it away from broke people. When you have working people who are getting notices in the mail that tell them that they'll be paying twice as much for their health insurance, when you're having people who will be off of their health insurance, when you're having what I had the other day, which is notification from my health provider that stuff I've been getting for a long time is now going to cost $500. When you have that going on and you're simultaneously at war with public schools, you are at war with all kinds of programming that gives people housing, gives people food, you're going to stir up crime. The countries that meet people's basic needs have less crime in general. I mean, there are very few exceptions to that. So you have a president who's very actively hollering that we have a crime crisis when we do not, but he's wishing it into being by cutting access for people who need government to help them to meet their basic needs. There's no question in my mind that Donald Trump is very, very sad today that we don't have more crime. And he's trying to foment it. And he's trying to do it not because he's opposed to crime. He commits crimes all the time himself. He pardons people for money. He pardons people who are part of his private goon squad. This is not someone who hates crime. This is someone who loves crime when it's done for his benefit. But the reason that he is doing all of this is that if he is able to scapegoat various communities by starving them, by making sure their basic needs are not met, it gives him the excuse he needs to roll tanks.
A lot of the issue here we've seen in the Gallup polling is there's been this partisan divide. Whenever Democrats in office, the Republicans tend to think crime is rising. Whenever Republicans in charge, Democrats tend to think crime is rising. That gap has obviously grown quite a bit in the last few years. How do you respond to individuals when you're talking and I see the numbers and I follow the numbers and I see everything's going down? How do you respond to individuals when you don't get acknowledgement or appreciation or just awareness of the fact that what you're saying is actually what's borne out in the numbers?
It's a great question. I mean, to some extent, you just keep telling the truth. You just be that donkey that's trudging up a hill. No matter how many times you get whacked with a board, just keep trudging up the hill. Because, if you just keep telling the truth until people hear it, they might hear it. Another thing that you do is you make sure it's not always your voice. So, for example, if you have victims, if you have survivors who agree with what you're doing, and we know that we do in Philly, because the neighborhoods that have been most supportive of our reform policies are the neighborhoods that have had the most shootings, right? That was not a foregone conclusion, but that's what's actually happened in Philadelphia. The neighborhoods most affected by the worst violent crime have fully supported us because they know that the old tactics didn't work and didn't make their lives any better. So some of those voices come in, and they are there to say, I lost my son but I truly appreciate what this DA's office is doing because they emphasize prevention, because they're involved with modern enforcement, because they want to make sure more crimes get solved. There's a very common perception, and it's accurate in broke Black and brown communities, that killing one of them is less of a priority for police. And I don't say this to throw any shade at the Philadelphia Police Department. I'm not saying that. But there is that common perception. There is also some data out there showing that those crimes are less likely to be solved. In a way, that's really a unifying concept, that those neighborhoods often feel like they have been occupied, their rights have been demeaned, they're getting searched, stopped for no good reason. But on the other hand, when someone gets killed in the neighborhood, is less of a priority than if someone gets killed in more affluent sections of town, right? So you get those voices out there. It's not just the elected official talking. It's not just the prosecutor talking. It's the community talking. And they are saying, yeah, that's what we want. That's how we want to do this. This has been good in my individual situation. Ultimately, though, it's really just a combination of storytelling, truthful storytelling, real stories, ideally with some messengers other than the office holder. But it's also the data. It's connecting the data to the stories, because every listener is different. Some of them hear numbers, some of them hear stories, some of them hear both. And you have to give them the opportunity to learn the way they learn best.
Is your approach any different if it's not just, person on the street, just not just media press conference, but you're in front of, the Pennsylvania state legislature? If you're speaking to other electeds, is your approach any different, or is it just keep hitting them on the head with the data and the stories?
Well, the Pennsylvania legislature, and I'm sure this is true of many of my colleagues around the country, is in a different position. At their worst, some of them are elected office holders in counties that have no meaningful industry anymore other than prisons. They have a very understandable reason to want to lock up people from far away and put them in their prisons. It's going to keep the public school open. It's going to pay for the repaving of the parking lot. It's going to keep the diner open. The correctional officers are going to get nervous if the local prison is closed. So that's not actually about persuasion. Those are generally not people who want the truth. They just want prisoners. That's it. Sorry to be so blunt, but that's reality. They like that conveyor belt of Philadelphians coming to their prisons because they're getting $60,000 a head per person in that prison per year. And that gets pretty meaningful when it's 1,000 people. So it's $60 million a year coming into a place that used to have coal and used to have steel, but doesn't have either one anymore. That's not about persuasion. And it does actually explain a lot of what has happened statewide, because, during our administration, we have gone from 13,000 Philadelphians in state prison to 9,000. Well, that's 4,000 less a year. That's, let me see, 240 million fewer dollars flowing into, wherever it is. Some of these counties are named things like Elk or named things like Carbon in what used to be a coal state, right? It's a lot. It's a lot of money that's not coming to them. So persuasion is not really on the table with them. But on the other hand, there are elected officials who really want to do the right thing, who are not so beholden to a commerce in human beings coming out of Philadelphia and going into their jail. And with them, I think it is much more of trying to be factual, trying to be persuasive, offering our help. We often do that. We'll offer our help in terms of legislation that they are thinking of writing, and we'll stay in the background and not talk publicly about it. That's what they want.
And have you had any luck in terms of expanding your data practices to other DA's offices throughout the country? And, assuming that you've had at least some luck, what's the key to the lessons learned and helping other DAs, whether or not they're reformer DAs or what other type of DAs you want to call them, just prosecutors that want to do a good job? How do you help them with their data practices?
I mean, I don't really know every benefit that's come from it, but I know this. I know that our data lab is viewed as either the leading or one of the leading public-facing data labs that is within a district attorney's office. No shade on my criminologist friends or you. I'm just speaking of among the electeds. Most DA's offices have been black boxes on purpose. The only use they have for their data is to promote the career of the elected official, or it's internal. It's to monitor whether a particular unit is doing what they want that particular unit to do. but it's not external facing. I think the general recognition among people who are interested in transparency, truth, science, and all that kind of stuff, that ours is one of the leading, if not the leading, public-facing data lab has been that, and we've seen this reflected at various gatherings and conventions, has been that there are others who want to emulate it, or at least want to study it, or at least want to think about it, which I think is pretty important. We've seen a sort of a different thing in Philly, which I think is really interesting and impressive. And that has to do with a sort of an offshoot of the data lab, which is a grant-funded collab. And we call it a collab because essentially it exists for the purpose of helping local communities solve data questions when it comes to crime. So if you're in a part of the city where all hell breaks loose when the bars close, and you have locals who want you to geomap the shootings that occur, the time they occur, where they occur in relation to liquor establishments that are closing at a particular time, we provide that. If they have a different set of questions, which has to do with, how many drug arrests were made in a particular area, we'll help with that. If they have questions about ATMs, how many robberies are occurring near ATMs, or would it make a difference if the ATMs were closed after a certain hour, that sort of thing, we'll help them answer that. But the point is, it's driven by communities, thus collab. It is a collaboration with them, but it is driven by communities. They're asking those questions and we're answering those questions. And we have found over and over that the neighborhoods in Philadelphia, which are very different in many ways. I mean, it's a great cohesive city in a lot of ways, but each neighborhood has unique challenges, unique issues. We have found that they are often the best at articulating the questions for what will affect their area, and the best in many ways at crowdsourcing innovations and ideas. So, that is a different way for this to go. It's not led by the elected and his criminologist and his data team. It's led by the community. We've seen some real benefits there as well.
What else is next for the third term?
So many things. As we speak, we have a very intelligent person in the office who is going to our busy supervisors and a lot of our roughly 300 attorneys, as well as some non-lawyer staff, to ask them for ideas. Part of the problem is when you are in a prosecutor's office or even a public defender's office, and you're working hard on every day's case or every next week's case, it's hard to see the big picture and slow down. So we have someone who's going around actively interviewing and discussing with busy people what they would see as an improvement and an innovation. We're also, of course, looking at national models for what seems to be working. We're talking to people who are local, but we are trying to have a pretty robust, pretty ambitious, not just aspirational agenda for a third term. We find ourselves in an almost unique position because we not only have the lowest homicide numbers and tremendous improvements, reductions in the number of shootings, reductions in the number of victims, but we have crime going down in 14 out of 18 categories and subcategories that are published by the Philadelphia Police Department every day, right? We are seeing huge improvements in public safety, historic improvements in public safety at the same time as we are seeing the lowest number of people incarcerated in the county system, for example, in my career. When you got homicides at a 50-plus year low and you have county incarceration at a 40-year low, and you have that all at the same time, meanwhile, you're also seeing a huge reduction in the number of state prisoners coming out of Philadelphia. That means you have more safety and you have more freedom and you have it all at the same time. So we do have the wind at our back in terms of how Philadelphia feels about what we're doing. In my opinion, we have an excellent police commissioner who's trying to do the right thing. There are a lot of other players, including city council and the mayor, who I think have learned some of the lessons of the pandemic and are pushing us in a positive direction. But I will say this, there is a dream. There is a distant dream that we might be able to get better and better and better and start breaking historic records in terms of things like homicides and shootings. I will say that I'm 7 years in now advocating for Philadelphia to come up to standards when it comes to its bandwidth for forensic science, its technology for forensic science. We've been able to do some of that within the office, but a state-of-the-art crime lab that would assemble these different libraries of data in order to connect shooting groups, members, in order to connect one shooting to another when there are no witnesses. I believe that could knock us down another 10% on what I expect to be a record-setting year this year. And to put it mildly, that is worth the investment at every single level. So that would be one of the many things on the agenda. It's something we've advocated for a long time. It's just like everything else in politics is moving at a slightly glacial pace.
That's great. Last question is, if there's one piece of advice that you could give to other DAs to better communicate their success, to better employ data in telling the story of what their office is doing, what would that be?
Well, number one, tell the truth all the time. And this, by the way, some of this actually relates to work that I did as a law student. I worked as a law student for an organization called Coalition for the Homeless in New York City. The head of that organization, who had come out of corporate America, had a policy of always trying to help out honest journalists and always trying to engage them with data and with facts, even if the facts didn't help you, because then you developed credibility with them and they were more likely to listen to you when it mattered. I think he was right about that. I also learned a lot about dealing with media from ACT UP, which was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It was an activist group dealing with HIV and AIDS in its earliest and most heinous days, some of whose members were leading public relations people in New York City. They really knew what the hell they were doing when it came to communications. And some of the lessons that I took from that as a volunteer attorney who used to represent them, when the district attorneys who used to hold my job would prosecute them for exercising free speech rights, some of those lessons I have found to be priceless. I think that, number one, you have to tell the truth all the time. Number two, you need to very actively and proactively engage the media. Do not sit around and wait for them to come and get you when you're on the back of your heels. You should be on the balls of your feet, moving forward, bringing them information, dealing with issues when all the other electeds in the city are hiding. You need to do that. And if you do that, you become, at least over a period of years, you become a credible voice to people in that jurisdiction, the journalists who want to do it right, who don't want to just engage in, what bleeds leads, the type of sleazy journalism, sleazy social media, sleazy politics, sleazy entertainment that has been brainwashing us forever. What you'll see is the good ones will rise to the occasion.
Larry, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with me today. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.